Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, hello to everyone. We're going to start here in just a moment. Get a cup of tea, get comfortable. Okay. Paul, are you ready to roll? Okay. Wonderful. So let's get started. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's great to see friends and fellow travelers, some new faces as well. My name is Ariel Mays. I'm the senior scholar in residence here at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society. At the IJSS, the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society, our mission is to advance scholarship and social transformation by bringing Jewish spiritual knowledge to bear on the toughest challenges of contemporary life. Key to this work is fostering conversations and gatherings. And it's to this end that we convene this monthly speaker series called the Verbringen, the Coming Together, as a space for reflection, for thinking, and for community making. It's my real honor, a pleasure, to introduce Paul Nahme, Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Judaic Studies at Brown University. Paul works at the intersection of modern Jewish thought, race, and religion. His scholarship and teaching explore how ideas of identity, belonging, and public life are shaped by the emotional and sometimes racialized modern Jewish experience. He's written two really wonderful books, Hermann Cohen and the Crisis of Liberalism, The Enchantment of the Public Sphere, and Ghost People, most recently, Ghost People, Race, Religion, and the Affective Sources of Modern Jewish Identity. Everyone should read these, or at the very least, it's worth buying them. I should also say that Paul is a dear friend. He's been a teacher and friend of mine. I was thinking about this morning. I think for 16 years, we first met in 2009, where when, after my first conversation with Paul, I realized I was in the presence not only of a superior intellect who had mastered the best of Athens and Jerusalem, but a first class teacher and mensch. So, with those words, I'm going to invite Paul to speak now for the next 30, 35 minutes or so. As usual, there will be time for a lively question and answer after that. And please join me in welcoming Paul.
Well, thank you, Ariel, first of all, for that introduction and for those very sweet words. It's been a mutual admiration society. I've learned an immense amount from you. And I'm really, really delighted to be here. So thank you to Michael, thank you to Ariel, thank you to Denise for setting this up. Thank you to all of you for being here. Um, so what I want to do today is a combination of things, really. As an academic who happens to study a tradition that I'm deeply invested in, there's this constant juggling going on in terms of um, treating what I study as a scholar would. And of course, questions of what scholarship is and Jewish studies they've been hotly debated since the origins of the field. But I'm a deeply invested Yid, so to speak. And so one of the things that I want to do today is sort of bring together some reflections on a project that I'm working on right now, which is really about Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism as an American religion, sort of telling the tale of how Chabad, in the last, let's say, 75 years or so, has really sort of grown in America specifically, and to think of it as a distinctly American religion. So there's a lot of technical terminology I would bring to bear on how to explain that. But what I also want to do is reflect on what that means. What does it mean to be a Jew, and to think about Jewishness and Judaism both in an American context, when Chabad, especially as perhaps one of the most visible forms of Hasidism in America today, um, is very much shaped by the American experience. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be shaped by the American experience? So what I want to do today is I'm going to walk you through a bit of a slideshow that I have sources that are translated in English. They'll be on the PowerPoint presentation, but I've also, I hope we could share. I have a longer source sheet that has some of the Hebrew original. If you want to take a look at that, I've tried to highlight the passages we'll be reading together, so you can use that if you'd like. Is it still in the chat? Can someone just let me know, Ariel, if it's been distributed or not? Or should I put it in again?
Why don't you pop it in again?
Okay.
Thanks.
I can put it in.
Oh,
Thanks, Steve.
thank you, James, because
Perfect.
then I'll get started if that's okay. Okay. Okay, here we go. So really what we want to do today is think about how Jews have had to negotiate this kind of theological conundrum of bechira, of chosenness, election, the election of Israel in America, and to think about what that means in the American Jewish landscape, but also in the American landscape. And so it's hard to talk about religion in America without encountering race as this category that's sort of organized how American populations have been organized. So waves of Jewish immigration have experienced very different kinds of racial categories in American history, and we can go into you can explore all of that in detail as a historian does. But what I want to do today is actually focus on a very specific moment in the way that race has been self-narrated by folks that have been racialized in America, and I want to start with W.E.B. Du Bois, who some of you might know very famously wrote a text called The Souls of Black Folk, and really at the very beginning of the 1900s, and sort of had a career that spanned into the uh, really quite big, let's say, first half of the century, exploring questions around what does it mean to experience racial categories as well as to study the people that you're a part of. So there's something about Du Bois, I think, that's kind of reflective of the situation I feel like I'm in, very much implicated as a subject, implicated as someone who cares deeply about this tradition that I study, but also in many ways trying to study it with a seriousness. And so sometimes you come with questions about what does this feel like to be kind of caught in this bind between a rock and a hard place. So I just want to share with you this quote very briefly that Du Bois, um, just as describing his own experience growing up as a child in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where he says, and some of you might recognize some of this language from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book of the same title, Between Me and the Other World, or Between the World and Me is really the way it's named. So between me and the other world, there is an ever unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others the difficulty of rightly framing it, all nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously and compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? They say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I seldom answer a word. And yet, being a problem is a strange experience, peculiar even for one who has never been anything else, save perhaps in babyhood and in Europe. That last little line is quite interesting because it's important to note that Du Bois went and studied in Berlin, at the University of Berlin, in the 1890s, where I talk about this a little bit in my book that just came out. He overlapped, or sort of overlapped with Martin Buber studying at the University of Berlin. They both took the same seminar, the philosophy or history of philosophy with Wilhelm Dilthey. And I think there's something really important about how both Buber and Du Bois learned something from their experience of studying there that then led them to reflect on very specific kinds of emotional dimensions of both Jewish and Black history in America. So just something to note. The young man Du Bois there. Okay, but what does that do for us? It leads us to our question, which is to think about how the Jews in Europe, as the people that were racialized. So when Du Bois goes there and he's like, I don't feel race in Europe because people just think of me as a curiosity, but they're not thinking about me as the problem. Why? Because there's another problem in Europe, which Du Bois wrote about in many other texts, namely the Jews. So you can see here, we don't have to go into detail to read it, but I just wanted to give you an example. This is a discourse. It starts in like 1783. I mean, it starts earlier than 1783, but this notion of the problem of chosenness as chauvinism. In other words, Jews might invite the hatred that they experience upon themselves because they see themselves as special, as distinct, right? As chosen. God forbid, chosen by God. God's supposed to be a God of the universe. So how could you have a particular people that's chosen? This is the problem of the universal and the particular. This is a real question that haunts Jewish thought in Europe. But then when we come into thinking about America, what we're really talking about is understanding what it means for Jews who have this history of being a particular people who were, in many cases, not afforded rights or recognition under European states, under these models of constitutional, growing constitutional rights as they emerge and variously do so in Germany quite late. So maybe there's a story there about why Jews suffer the greatest violence upon them en masse in Jewish history in that place, but that's for a different time, perhaps. I don't want to dwell on the negative. Nevertheless, what I am trying to think about is what happens when some of those ideas immigrate to America, right? What happens when we come into the American context with this problem of a moral universal, right? We are all supposed to be human beings. We're all supposed to be afforded some kind of inherent right. And especially if you're a theist, we're all supposed to be humans who are created by God, by the same God. But what happens when the Jews carry with them this sense of chosenness and election, right? This particular way of thinking. And what do you do when in America, the visibility of that Jewishness, right, is perhaps less risky than it was in Europe for reasons that we can get into, some of which have to do with the fact that, as Du Bois was pointing out, well, in Europe, the Jews were the biggest problem. So Du Bois had some respite from feeling like he himself was a problem in the racial categories that are there. But in America, the racial categories were different. It's a black-white binary. So when Jews come into this framework, even though they have a different experience, at certain times they're not quite right, not quite white, I should say, sorry, not the right amount of white, perhaps. And what whiteness means here is very much a category of classification. It's not about some kind of inherent genetic code of some sort or biology, even though what I'm going to sort of suggest to you today is that maybe there is something distinctive about the Jews that's worth actually owning and not trying to apologize away. But nevertheless, as you can see the picture of a Chabad sukkah right in front of the Capitol, you can see why the visibility of Jewishness is perhaps less risky in America. So what does that mean? So we nevertheless have Jews who now are encountering in America a different framework for them, right? If Jews look a certain way, they might risk being classified as on the wrong side of the color line. On the other hand, their language, what they bring with them, their indigenous languages, whether it's Yiddish, whether, if they're coming from the Mizrahi world, which is always the case, but I have a picture here of an Armenian Jew in 1926, which probably means Turkish/Syrian, not entirely clear how the classifications work, but would probably bring a slightly different tongue with them, a mother tongue of sorts. Some of that gets integrated, but the visual cues of how Jews make sense of their place in America skew towards this idea of perhaps we need to look and play the part of being white folk. So, okay, let me fast forward from this point to the 90s. And why do I want to go there? I want us to understand that something specific happens with the visibility of Jewishness in America in and around 1991 that directly relates to my story that I want to tell about Chabad Lubavitch. And some of you might remember the Crown Heights riots from 1991. What was going on in the background, right, in America at this time? Between Jesse Jackson having a sort of failed attempt for a primary run of the presidency, making a comment about Hymietown as a way of characterizing New York, a open mic, hot mic moment, is what I meant to say, not open mic, hot mic. I don't think one would go to an open mic and say that, but maybe caught on tape. The dissemination of the Rodney King video, so to speak. And then, of course, the notorious Louis Farrakhan making lots of very interesting and suggestive and hateful remarks about Jews. So that's the scene. And so in that moment, we have this eruption of violence in Crown Heights that pits Hasidim, Chabad Lubavitch Hasidim, mostly men, to be very clear, against the Afro-Caribbean population that lives there. So just like take a look at these photos for a second. The visual cues of them are very important. And just to warn everybody, I am going to show another set of images that might be somewhat triggering a little. It's not active violence, but the results of violence. So just, be warned. The bodies that are targeted, right, in the Crown Heights riots are not white bodies. They're Jewish bodies. That is to say that all incidents of physical attacks, and even including an actual murder of Yankel Rosenbaum, they were all visibly Jewish. So the question I'm sort of interested in is like, okay, wait, are Jews really always classified as white? And in moments of racial tension in America, why is it that Hasidic Jews in particular are often the ones who have their bodies most directly visited with violence? And this is an ongoing problem. There's literally YouTube and TikTok videos of Hasidim being attacked randomly throughout Brooklyn in the last 5 years. It's just, I don't know why people compile that, maybe for posterity, but it's scary. It's really scary stuff. So there's a lot going on here in the background. You might not recognize this gentleman in the middle, or the Reverend Al Sharpton, long before the workout exercise and diet change. Said some pretty complicated, troubling things about Jews. I actually, for the sake of time, want to skip through that because I want to move us more into what I think is the more interesting questions for us about how does this affect Jews in their own perceptions of themselves. So there's a lot going on here as thinking about Jews as proxies for whiteness, but the way that the rhetoric that Sharpton used, for example, you can see really kind of traffics and tropes, even the images I showed. Why would you burn an Israeli flag when you're protesting Hasidim, and especially Chabad, which during the lifetime of the Rebbe was not overtly Zionist. I think to this day still it's fair to say that Chabad Lubavitch are not overtly Zionist as an ideological position. What that means is just they don't use that term, but if it quacks like a duck, I don't know how you say that, right? It quacks a lot. So the idea though is that Chabad would not be most obviously identified as a Zionist organization. So why burn an Israeli flag? Why yell Heil Hitler if you're trying to protest white people? So there's a whole story here about tensions between Black and Jewish residents, but Hasidic specifically residents in Crown Heights that I'm really trying to think about. Okay, so let's back up and understand why. Quote here from James Baldwin, very famously, some of you might remember this or know of this. There's this whole question about what does it mean to be an assimilated Jew in America? As Baldwin, I think, quite rightly put it, in the American context, the most ironical thing about Negro anti-Semitism is that the Negro is really condemning the Jew for having become an American white man, for having become, in effect, a Christian. So there's something about the relationship between race and religion in America that Baldwin noted right out the gates. And so there was a style of thinking in American Jewish thought, including my teacher, David Novak, who I have the profoundest respect for, but nevertheless wanted to grapple with this problem. We go back to this problem of election and of integrating Jewishness into an American scene and wanting to basically apologize for what appears like a chauvinistic position. So if you have the chance, you can also scan the source. I'm not going to read it inside, but just in short, what I'm going to explain, Novak's position is that we need to have a higher standard than the Torah alone to be able to understand why the Torah was given to the Jews. In other words, there needs to be a universal rational standard by which all human beings, non-Jews and Jews alike, must be held to, because it's the God-given standard. It's a universal. And that's what makes us all moral. While Jews have the Torah and the 613 mitzvot, non-Jews have the 7 Noahide laws as a kind of natural law, which is a rational, kind of abstract set of norms, set of rules. And that was the rationalist position that Novak believed would defend against the charge, you'll see of this last line here, that the idea of the chosen people might be confused with the odious idea of a Herrenvolk, right? A master race. Because, of course, the Jews, as the victims of that ideology, God forbid, should be the ones that are perhaps offering something similar. So that's how Novak tried to address this. But what's really interesting, for those of you that may or may not know, Chabad Lubavitch philosophy has often been labeled as, in many cases, a kind of quote unquote metaphysical racism. Um, it by Jews mostly. I mean, Jews are often the ones that are, they say to themselves, I want to learn, not who's, I don't know who I'm talking about, maybe just friends I've had in the past were like, I'd love to learn some Hasidus. I'm going to start learning Tanya. And they all get stuck at the end and begin of chapter one, transitioning into chapter two, because like, wait a second, what's going on in here? What is happening in this metaphysics? So the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, Rosh Zalman of Liadi, the first Rebbe of Chabad, um, makes this claim that I think is often quite troubling for people, namely that every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, possesses two souls. One of these souls, I'm just reading the bolded text, derives from the klipa and the sitra achra and is clothed in the human blood to give life to the body. Okay, so klipa, meaning the husks, the sort of shard, the remnant of the original breaking of the vessels in Kabbalistic understanding of like the sort of set up for creation itself. There's a kind of primordial creative or formative act. And it's a bit of a divine drama in which there is a kind of shattering of vessels, and the shattered vessels themselves, kind of like if you had a clay jar with olive oil in it, right? The oil is still stuck to the shards as they kind of scatter throughout this kind of supernal abyss that opens up for creation to take place. So this becomes part of Kabbalistic and Hasidic understandings of what does it mean to live in a world where something's off, clearly. Something is broken in this world that needs repair. And of course, Jewish history in many cases is invoked to prove precisely that there's a historical and theological drama that demonstrates this over and over again. So to say that the klipa, right, this part of the other side, the source of evil that exists, the rationale for why there's evil in this world, is what implicates Jews as much as non-Jews, is part of the theology. However, the Alter Rebbe goes on to say, even, this is the next bolded section, right? Even the naturally good qualities found in every Jew, such as compassion and acts of kindness, come from this soul. For in the case of Israel, this klipa-derived soul originates in the klipat noga, right? Which is to say, the klipa that can have a certain transformation. It can, the redemptive capacity for like, oh, there's still oil on the shard. Well, we can collect the oil and somehow use the shard, scrape it off to get it back to where it needs to be. So it can go either way. It's a kind of Janus-faced shard, if you will. It could be good or bad. So Jews participate in that. And that's related to also understanding the finite material world, stuff. How do we have Gashmius, the sort of, concrete stuff in this world? So Jews do have that dimension of soul. However, they also have another part, which I'll just share in a second. But this, to note very importantly, and this is the part that bothers everybody when they read it, this differs entirely from the souls of the nations of the world, which derive from the other impure klipot that contain no good whatsoever. So it seems as though Jews have the capacity to purify their soul because they also have a second soul. So they have this nefesh behemit, this animal soul, as well as a nefesh elokit, a divine soul. And this is the second soul that's unique to Jews, right? Which is truly a part of God from above. So to think about, there's a piece of divinity in every Jew that might be lacking in non-Jews, strikes many people as the kind of chauvinism, right, that we're really worried about. So what I want to offer to you in the time that remains, which is not much, is a few sources here to think about what it is about the seventh Rebbe of Chabad, Reb Menachem Mendel Schneerson, offered in a moment of this heightened racial tension in Crown Heights and in America, trying to understand the role of the Jew. And not just the Hasidic Jew here, but because as some of you might know, the reason why Chabad is so invested in this kind of outreach program is because they believe that that divine element that every Jew has is regardless of their observance or knowledge. So it's the Pintal Yid, as it said, the Nekuda, that's point that's somehow right in your soul, the core of what makes you a Jew. That means that no Jew is beyond redeeming. And unlike other Kiruv, other kind of organizations that are dedicated to trying to make Jews more religious, Chabad has a strange paradoxical approach, which is like, it's not about making you all or nothing observant. It's about making you anything observant. We'll start with whatever. I literally went to a Farbrengen where I heard a Rav say something to the effect of talking to a bunch of non-observant Jews in a Chabad house, and he said, he had about, 3 shots of vodka at this point, so maybe that's why. He's like, hey, he says it's Shabbos. If it's Shabbos, then, don't drive to shul. Take an Uber. Uber's better. And one of the people was like, Rabbi, I don't understand. Isn't that still bad? He's like, yeah, sure, but it's better than driving. And so there's that something about that approach of being like, okay, interesting. So trying to literally reach everyone, even when you would never assume another Haredi rabbi would ever say something like that. There's something here theologically is what I'm trying to get at. But I want to offer to you the following. I want to share these texts that maybe we can talk about in depth. And I want to just frame them. I believe that the argument historically that the Alter Rebbe was making about the distinctiveness of Jews is something that has to be read in context, right? If you are living in 18th century Eastern Europe and you are facing the kinds of persecutions that Jews are facing, the violence that is very quotidian, it's every day, right? The precarity of being Jewish. Maybe metaphysics is the only way that you can achieve some kind of safety. There is a plan. There's a reason why we're in this situation. There's a reason why, and this is very timely, given the fact that in the last 2 days was a very important holiday in the Chabad calendar, but writ large, I'd say in the Hasidic calendar, which is to say Yud Tes Kislev, which celebrates, so to speak, the Rosh Hashanah of the Hasidic year, or also more specifically, both the yahrzeit of the Magid HaMezritch, as well as also the moment of freedom of Rosh Shneur Zalman of Liadi from his imprisonment under the Imperial Russian authorities after some of accusations of Hasidism being heretical, but also politically subversive, surfaced. So this is a celebration, if you will, of how Hasidism became something opened up to the world, even though perhaps God didn't initially want these secrets to be revealed. And that might be why the Rebbe was imprisoned, for example. In other words, bad things happen for a reason, but Hasidus had to also go through this moment of, let's say, challenge in order to bring new things to the world. And I think that what happens by the time we get to the American scene, that what the seventh Rebbe of Lubavitch, Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson, is doing is thinking very seriously about how to balance the fact that there is this tradition of a quasi-chauvinism of, yes, Jews are metaphysically different. They're different than non-Jews. But it's not because Jews are white. No, they're Jews. There are Jews and there are Goyim. There are Jews and non-Jews. But does that mean that we should have disdain for non-Jews? I would argue that the Rebbe is thinking very seriously about a metaphysical and cosmological framework that's trying to respond to the reality of being in America at the same time that he was trying to also honor the traditions of Chabad. And so how do you balance those two things is kind of what I'm interested in us talking about. So again, I don't think I'll have time to share all of the text. What I wanted to just share is these kind of sections here that are bolded. And then if you want to follow along in your source sheet, if there's something that you're interested in talking about, I really encourage you to keep reading. So for example, in a sikha, in a talk that was given at a Farbrengen, in around the Parshas Lech Lecha, I believe this was in 1982, although I don't have the exact date. I apologize for that. I just pulled it out of another source. One of the things that the Rebbe emphasizes here is the distinctiveness of the Jew. So he says, to follow some of in keeping with the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, he says, in Abraham himself, right, but Abraham, the Gufa, he's designated as unique, as set apart from the rest of humanity in his land and in his birthplace, including in the house of his father. The Torah, I'm going to go just to the bolded, emphasizes the substance of Abraham, of Israel, of every Jew. For all the other peoples, their proximity and connection to the creator of the world depends on their coming to know and to recognize the creator. As by means of this, they establish a bond with the Holy Blessed One and uphold his commandments. By contrast, for the people of Israel, the ground of their proximity to divinity and their existence as Jews, not in the sense that for their own part they elevate themselves to the point of recognizing the Creator, right? It's not that they're coming to this knowledge. Rather, it's in the fact that the Holy Blessed One made them distinct and set them apart. In other words, for the Rebbe, this is part of creation. The people of Israel are not merely an additional type within creation. Rather, they have an entirely other substance. So unlike non-Jews, who are part of the created world. And this is how I think he's trying to make sense of this idea of the klipa, right? The most material dimensions of this world that are fallen, which is to, and of course in Chabad theology, there's a way of understanding that there's only an apparent sort of fallenness or only an apparent concreteness, right? There's the whole task in some ways is to sort of nullify the illusion of the distinctness between finite stuff and then the infinite God, right? We have to work to see through it. That's a very complicated theology, but it's just worth saying that there's this kind of, we have to see past the apparent obstruction. But the Rebbe seems to be suggesting that non-Jews are distinct from Jews. But that's because they're simply they are embodied as part of this created world like we are, except that element of the soul of the Jew, right, is actually a portion of a supernal divinity, even in the realm of the lower world. So there's something of the supernal realm that's right inside your soul. It's what makes you, as a Jew, capable of discovering something that then leads you back to a connection that was always already there. It was foreordained by creation itself. So it doesn't exclude the non-Jew, I would argue. What it actually does is it says that there's just these different dimensions of the same reality, and they're on different tracks. And this is how the Rebbe then understands the 7 Noachide laws, because it's precisely by means of the Noachide laws that the material world can be continuously perfected by non-Jews too. So why do I offer that? I'm going to jump ahead here to conclude. This is because when we think about Yud Tes Kislev, right, which is, I would say is kind of in my mind was the kind of organizing principle for today. I'm like, okay, if Farbrengen, it's Yud Tes Kislev post. It's Isru Chag, so to speak. So it's the day after, right? But we'll try to think about what that means. It was treated by the Alter Rebbe as in fact, a revelation of sorts. It was a kind of redemption of sorts, not just for him. It wasn't just about him getting out of prison. He wasn't just celebrating himself. He said, no, this is actually for the sake of all Jews. And interestingly, in a letter he wrote to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, the Kedushas Levi, that actually this is a public sanctification. So you read the text here, it says, it's been exalted and sanctified publicly, especially in the eyes of all the ministers and all the nations and all the provinces of the king, for whom also this matter was wondrous beyond wonder. And they responded, this is from God. It is wondrous in our eyes. The line from Hallel. So what the Alter Rebbe is saying something here that is counterintuitive to those that just read the Tanya and say, oh, the Alter Rebbe doesn't hold other non-Jews to be part of this kind of purpose of creation. And I'm just going to leave this on screen and paraphrase for you through a description of the relationship between the original source of what we as Jews have to think about as our future redemption. The 7th Rebbe of Lubavitch is talking about this letter. And this is another sikha that he gave on Yud Tes Kislev. So this is now Menachem Mendel Schneerson describing how we ought to read the Alter Rebbe. And he says, the example, the analog, the only way we'll ever understand what the days of the Messiah, what our redemption will look like, is to use Egypt as our model. And in Egypt, it was precisely because when Paro says, I do not know this name you say of Shem Havaya, the Yud K Vav K, the Tetragrammatron, I don't know that name. So the Rebbe says, right, because he only knew the name that governed nature, which is Elohim, which through Gematria, he equates with Teva, with nature itself, of course, which is a word that actually doesn't show up in the Torah. So that's an interesting attempt to kind of map things. But Elohim becomes the name that sort of governs nature, creation, which is where non-Jews are located. And so it's almost by virtue of the fact that there is the revelation of the Tetragrammatron, Shem Havaya, that Paro and the Egyptians come to know, oh, there is a God called Havaya, that what the Rebbe says is that of course the redemption of the non-Jewish world is necessarily a part of the redemption of the Jewish world, because Hasidic philosophy is precisely this turning outward, this publication of what are otherwise secrets, which you could maybe read as otherwise only secrets for the elected. So if non-Jews have to actually encounter not just Jews, but actually they have to encounter the secrets of Hasidic philosophy too, that's because these two redemptions are connected, meaning the redemption of Jews doing the work to reconnect their soul to divinity, right? Or to, rather, I should say, turn their already divine soul into a more catalyzed energy of divinity in this world. But that actually brings about non-Jews being also, if you will, redeemed. Okay, there's so much more to say here, but I really want to stop for conversation, just looking at time. So I'm going to pause there. Thanks for listening. Open to all your thoughts and comments. And I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay.
Stop sharing your screen, don't stop sharing your heart. That was such a tour de force of erudition and really, really thoughtful analysis of a very complicated internal dynamic within Chabad. Of the many things that you said, I'm really struck by the way that you painted a picture in which either radical or subtle or both modes of interpretation of religious leaders and thinkers in a particular context come about by not only looking to the outside, but also looking into the system files of a particular religious tradition, which are in and of themselves so often filled with disconsonance and filled with tensions that are so interesting when they begin to bubble to the surface, not through a kind of simplistic harmonization, but through really thinking deeply with the different modes and different voices within that polyphonic tradition. Just fantastic. So please, folks, you can use the Q&A function. You can drop questions into the chat. You can raise your hand. Paul, perhaps I'll let you field some questions. We have one in the chat that you can probably see about Yudtet Kislev. We have another from Robert, who unfortunately had to leave. If you want to say a couple words about Mordechai Kaplan, I have a sense that you've thought about that one before as well. Let's begin the conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll be, I mean, the Mordechai Kaplan conversation is I think a really significant one, because I agree that Kaplan really does think quite seriously about the racialization, if you will, of Jews, distinctively in America. And there's a lot to be said about Kaplan's understanding of a kind of embodied Judaism that I think is really fascinating. In a different version of this paper, I actually also think about Kaplan, but also Michael Wyshegrad, who's another thinker who should probably be introduced in this conversation, because Wyshegrad, in many ways, has there's a similar charge of maybe this is too much of a biological racialization of the Jew, or racial theological understanding. I don't know. I have a different read on Wyshegrad. I don't want to go there because the question was technically about Kaplan, and even then I'm punting because I didn't talk about Kaplan so much here. I do think there's something to be said there. So I appreciate that, even though I think the person might have left already. The question about Yudtes Kislev. So yes, I mean, Yudtes Kislev as the kind of day of celebration of like a Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus is a Chabad distinctive way of framing it, but it's also a Yom Dehilula. That's to say, it's a yard site for the Magid, and that is real in the sense of there's a rationale for other Hasidim to think of it seriously as a day worthy of study of a certain kind of spiritual component. I have not personally, although I've not spent a lot of time in other Hasidic courts that frequently, other than the kind of integrative modes of, let's say, someone like Rav Yitzchak Meir Morgenstern, I haven't seen a lot of, Hasidic groups outside Chabad that would treat the day as like there's something that distinctive that has to happen, or there maybe something spiritual has happened that we are trying to take cognizance of in the same way. That's also me kind of hedging. I'd probably punt that to Ariel to really double down on, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would say that in communities that either see themselves as the direct spiritual descendants of the Maggid of Mezrich, who died on Yotet Kislev in 1772, um, those who are actually his genetic progeny, the Rizhin Hasidic community amongst them, see this as a day that is particularly redolent in their community. But no one takes it on in the same way as Chabad. Also, great book sales if you are ever in Jerusalem or just go on the Kehot website. Yotet Kislev is usually the day where they've got the best sales. Got to get the word out.
That's right. Yeah, the
Good.
library.
Other thoughts, please raise your hands.
Okay, I see a question from Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Um, question about Jews and whiteness. Ah, right. So the question of how do Jews think about this question of the association of Jews and whiteness? Given that, I think so. Rachel made a point that I think is really important that there's a lot to be said about whether I mean it's you all might have thoughts and experiences of these kinds of conversations. There's I think a general sense that American Jews see themselves as not quite white, right? Like yes, in the sense of privilege, sort of participating and having a certain privilege of like sometimes being able to pass as white until something happens and the bageling effect happens, right? Where it's like similar to Du Bois's description of, oh, I knew a man who fought in Mechanicsville, or I knew a man who did this and that. You know, it's like I mean, I've experienced it myself sometimes in my past when I wasn't perhaps as bearded as I currently am, because now it's I think doesn't often mean a mistake. It's just like a guy came up to me in a park once and was like, "You look like Adam Sandler," and I was like, I think the word you're looking for is Jew. You're looking for the word Jew there because that's not, I don't look anything like Adam Sandler. Come on, let's be real. So, I mean, what a compliment. I mean, Gadol of comedy, but still not my take. I think though, so Rachel's question though is a really good one. How do Chabad, Lubavitch Hasidim see themselves? I think honestly, the answer is similar to what I was sort of not quite saying in jest, but what the Rebbe was kind of outlining as well. Is like but they would say it perhaps and just be like, "What? What is this white, black? I don't know what you're talking about. There's Jews and there's not Jews. Like that's all there is to do it. Like what else is there to say, right? Like we know that there's something distinctive about Jews, and that's why there's this investment in what I'm sort of calling the project of unassimilating American Jewry. And this is kind of what I was thinking about in terms of talking about um, the sort of shape of American Jewish life. Chabad has been very invested in shaping American Jewish life, not just American Judaism. Meaning, it's not. I don't think it's helpful to see Chabad Lubavitch as a kind of denomination, because of course that doesn't fit within Chabad framework either. The Rebbe apparently at one point said that the reason why he didn't want Chabad shlichim to be participants in denominational or interdenominational kinds of events and things like that was not because he has anything against conservative, reform, reconstructionist Jews. He thought that the idea of, and this I'm just paraphrasing, making an institution around being satisfied with where you're holding was not a good thing for Jews. And what that means is that if you want to crystallize an entire movement around being satisfied with your level of avoda, your level of connection, your level of feeling like your Jewishness is what permeates you, if you feel like it's just something you do on weekends, he was like, we don't, that's not something that Chabad should support because we want to support Jews growing in any way possible. And I think when you really get into the weeds of Chabad thought, I think that's related to this idea of it is not, there is an implicit understanding of a religio-racial idea here. That's just, I'm borrowing a term from Judith Weisenfeld, who has used this term in religious studies context to talk about like how we should understand kind of like different kinds of sort of messianic movements in Afro-American religion. Because also there are a lot of folks who in their experiences in being racialized as black in America were like, no, I'm not black. I'm the original Israelite. The sort of Hebrew Israelite movement is a good example of this, the black Hebrew Israelites. But there are lots of other examples. The Nation of Islam is another example of saying we are not black people per se. We are the real chosen people. So there's this whole discourse of taking the terms that are imposed on you and saying, we're not that. So when Chabadniks, I think, would say, like, no, we're white people. I don't even know what that term means. I'm a Jew. That means something different. So I think that's kind of where we start to see like something in the own self understanding, even though those terms would never be, no one would say religio-racial. I'm trying to use that as a term of art, but I think that's what's at stake here. Um, but I do look like Adam Sandler. Okay, I didn't know that. That's good. So I have here questions from Michael. I also have Sherry. Hi Sherry, great to see you. I don't know if
Shari would like to ask a question.
okay. Let's hi, go ahead. Hi Sherry.
Okay. Hey, Paul, good to see you. I hope
You
this
too.
isn't too in the weeds, but I am curious to hear more sort of about how you're thinking about this project and especially sort of, like obviously Henry Goldschmidt is like looming large in the background.
Mm,
So I'm curious, is this like the modern Jewish thought sort of intersecting with Henry Goldschmidt? Is that kind of what you're thinking about what you're doing? And sort of if you could also say a little bit more about sort of how you're thinking about the American religion sort of piece,
mhm.
and who you're reading and thinking with, and what sort of your take is on that part of it.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for that. So this is just I'm not gonna punt. I'm gonna try to answer, but I'm gonna say, Sherry, I hope you're going to AJS, and if so, I hope that we can talk about this because I actually want to pick your brain. You're not? Okay. That's okay. I'll pick your brain when I invite you to Brown. How about that? Okay. So the idea of this project, initially I was really trying to resist two things. One, that not resist. I'm trained as a kind of modern Jewish thought, intellectual history kind of person. I'm also trained primarily in a European tradition. So like this is like a new step for me in terms of trying to understand why it is that there's something translating from the European context into the American context. And that's how I'm sort of currently just that's where the ideas have been gestating. And my last book was really thinking about race in this way of what happens in Europe specifically and why does it feel so opaque to an American Jewish reading audience to think about race as a serious category that Jews would ever take seriously for themselves or be shaped by. So that's where this sort of started, and I'm really very much at the beginning of this project. So Henry Goldschmidt's book about Crown Heights, about various chosen peoples in Crown Heights, which I think is a great book. There's a lot going on there that's wonderful. Is primarily ethnographies and um, they're really fascinating because they show those moments of like what happens in the laundromat when the tensions come to bear on like who's using what washer or dryer, like those kind of micro negotiations of these tensions. And I think there's a lot there that's been informative for me. And so, yeah, I am sort of trying to do the more modern Jewish thought project, meaning what I want to do distinctively here is take seriously like Chabad theology and philosophy and to think about like which often doesn't get engaged and some of that just has to do with like there aren't folks that are necessarily trained in reading Kabbalistic and Hasidic texts that can do that kind of work at the same time that they're doing like the excellent work in anthropology or oral history or whatever it is. And so I'm sort of trying to fit into that conversation that way. Um, in terms of thinking about American religion, so I am thinking a little bit interestingly. I've been thinking a lot about my colleague Dan Vaca's work because one of the earliest conversations I had about this book, I was just an idea, and it doesn't matter who it was with, but someone who's kind of coming from the finance world was like, "Oh, so your book's about Chick-fil-A?" And I was like, "What?" It's like, yeah, it's basically about like the entrepreneurial spirit in America, and it's about the ways in which religion is business and the way in which like this is franchising. Like, Chabad Shliach, gets a certain amount of money for 1 year to go and set up a franchise and they have to build it themselves. And I was just like, huh. So is this a story about like the economy or rather the kind of economic ideals of an entrepreneurial spirit in America? What does that mean in like let's say the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? I mean, I'm trying to think about those kind of different frames. So I don't know where I'm going to land in terms of like my closest interlocutors. Obviously, the vibrant field of American religion is one that's like it's really intimidating to wade into. So I'll take all of your suggestions. How about that? Thank you.
Um, Paul, as you're speaking here and also in answering Sherry's wonderful question, um, I'm really struck by the fact that on the one hand, you're absolutely right that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was really instrumental and exerted an enormous force on the shaping of American Jewish life, and I think you're right to formulate it in those terms. It's also the case that he was both in aspiration and also in fact influential in shaping American religious life.
Mm.
And he saw the ambit of what it meant to be a Jew in America, not only in ethnic terms or in ratio religious terms that look inward, but also that look outwards. And maybe
Mm.
those are actually related one with the other. And there's an interesting, I wouldn't say splinter, but there's an interesting tension in his thinking, because I think you're correct to highlight the passages in which there's this irreducible difference in between Jews and non-Jews in his writing. Um, it's a little bit less developed in the scholarship on Rabbi Schneerson, but it's definitely there in his thinking, where he describes the intellectual soul of non-Jews as functioning almost exactly as that of the divine soul of Jews. And in that moment, you see him both grappling with a binary hierarchy that he has inherited, but in one fell swoop, reinterpreting it in such a way that the binary is both reinstated but also almost undone from the inside. And there's
Mm.
this really powerful universalism that you find within his thinking at the same time. So I'm wondering if you might speak just a little bit about that. And then I have one other question, and maybe I'll lay it on the table here and you can respond to both. I remember once hearing a story many years ago that the Frierdiker Rebbe was once listening to someone give a really interesting Devar Torah, and he said, Uvachen, so where do I take this? What do I do with this? And I'd like to
Mm.
ask you, Uvachen, Reb Zalman Shechter Shalomi once asked me, how do you daven that? Where do you find devotional inspiration in the story that you have told today, which is
Mm.
so compelling and so beautifully articulated?
So yeah, so this in your first question in some ways links does link very nicely with Sherry's question, and in terms of thinking about what it is about the the like the experience of being in America. I mean, think about like what's interesting, even with Crown Heights, the example of the Crown Heights riots that I was looking at. I mean, like it's not an accident that Mayor Dinkins goes to the Rebbe to receive a bracha. It's in the dollar line, which was very common for many. Just as now, I mean, even when Trump went to the Ohel, right? Like, there's a sense of like you pay your respects because this is part of the larger religious landscape. It's like there's something very interesting about that. But Dinkins, had a experience of going in the dollar line to meet the Rebbe before he became mayor. So there's a sense of like the Rebbe knew he had this connection and this influence, and it influenced him in turn, I think. And that dynamic is very real. Um, and I think that in some ways that does relate to your second question for me. So I guess I'm just acknowledging what you're saying is like this is very real, and I think that's why there are these tensions in these moments. Because I'm also not trying to suggest that Chabad Lubavitch is this sort of like transplant, right? That's just doing its own thing. That's in continuity with what it always did in Eastern Europe. I'm sort of trying to show that there's this influence of being in America. But I think you're like, I'm also trying to show, yes, the turning outward is the kind of like influencing American spiritual religious life. The Noahide campaign was very, very real for the Rebbe of like, that should be our program for non-Jews. So that's also there. But the second question has to do with the fact that I think for me, um, you know, I actually think that I think there's something really powerful with and I think about this is both my own personal take or my how would I frame this? A kind of as a spiritual kind of framing of like my own avoda, my own kind of worship, is that I think there is something distinctive about being a Jew. And I think that that's because I think the degree to which like I've been influenced by Hasidus is I try to infuse absolutely everything I do in my life with a kind of framing, an intentional consciousness that tries to bring this, whatever it is, back to some kind of connection with my creator. And That's not just halacha. It's not just doing mitzvahs. It's like when I go snowboarding, when I'm like rock climbing, when I'm teaching classes, whatever it is. I do a lot of things. I'm a weird guy. When I drive my van and randomly encounter, as I did pretty recently, a Chabadnik who was stranded in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, where there are very few Jews, and he couldn't get to his aunt in Toronto for Shabbos, and he thought I was driving a mitzvah tank. I mean, I also did roll the window down and yell Mashiach now, so maybe that's, it's not like I invited that
Crazy
one, but
idea.
so I don't. So it's an attempt to sort of, I think, take seriously what it means to be particularist and it not be chauvinist. Meaning, I want to do the things I do for reasons that are rooted in this tradition and in these sources and this mentality of a spiritual consciousness, not because there's some sort of standard outside of my tradition that's telling me I ought to do it. So, in other words, I want to be a particularist and I don't want to be an exclusivist. I don't want to say what the rest of the world is doing doesn't matter to me. I don't want to be insular, but I do want to be primarily committed, like I am to my family first, as those I love. I want to be committed to Yidden. I want to be committed to Jews and to my own soul, first and foremost, and hope it radiates outwards, that energy will like bring other people along. So, Michael, I saw you had also a hand up, so I want to make sure I give you the last moment.
Oh, thank you. Yay, I get the last word. Well, bringing heaven down to earth a little bit, as they say. First of all, I think it's interesting. The white question, so to speak, has always interested me because I notice very keenly that on almost on any form that you have to fill out, whether it's for a job or whatever, I'm always like looking for, and this is not my question, this is just a comment. I'm always looking for what is my category, right? Pacific Islander, Black, Latino, prefer not to answer, white, right? And I never feel like there's the right category for me. So I just think that's a very interesting thing to think about,
Mm.
whether there could be another category and what would that category be. But and we could talk about that sometime, but my question really is about, we're talking about it in academic terms, but like, if I'm at a cocktail party with you and Adam Sandler, right, and a bunch of um, non-Jews, and I'm supposed to explain how we're different or separate, it feels a little bit like separate but equal to me, right? And so, like, how am I talking to like a friend of mine? Like, that doesn't seem like it's going to fly, to be completely honest. I'm going to tell him like, well, I'm special, you're quasi special, but more like, how do you talk about it in non-academic terms?
So there's a great, I don't know if it's an answer, but what immediately pops in my head is that Sarah Silverman, in an old stand-up bit, we're talking like probably going back 20 years. It's called Jesus is Magic, is really what the special is called. She at the time was dating Jimmy Kimmel, and so she was talking about how she's in an interfaith relationship, and she's like, well, my boyfriend isn't Jewish, and we talk a lot about what it would mean if we had kids. And I say it's easy. We'll let them choose. And he's like, oh, okay. Well, how's that going to work? And she's like, it's fine. We'll just lay it out. It's like, honey, you can be a member of the chosen people like mommy, or you can be like daddy and believe that Jesus is magic. Your choice. Which, of course, I'm sorry, this is a flippant and very
No,
non-academic. And sorry if that's off color for some people, but like I like comedy, and comedy is the last vestige of non-cancelable material, I believe. And Sarah Silverman is a good yid, so it's like, I feel like it's worth quoting. So I think what it comes down to is you're right. I don't think this is a kind of so okay. There's ways I even interact with my students about talking about like what it is that motivates them and whatever I teach at Brown. It's a very politically engaged campus. University campuses right now are, there are some wild places. And yet I've really cultivated relationships with students across the spectrum politically, primarily the Jewish students. And I think because they feel like they can come and talk to me, because I don't bring ideology into my classroom. I teach them how to be critical. And so I think that's my job as a scholar, is to teach them to think about every single idea, and that there are no ideas that are really cancelable. We should really talk about it in very serious terms. But also I think because I really think that what I try to cultivate is a sense of like, I don't care what your politics are. What I care about is whether or not you're rooting it in your tradition. Are you rooting your motivations, your universal aspirations even in a particular tradition. If you can find that bridge and you feel like that's authentic, then I would love to help you find better sources. I'd love to help you think about this more deeply. I'd love to think about why it is that maybe, there have been precedents before that you could draw on. You're not reinventing the wheel here. Some people might not see that as a translation into the real world practice of what I'm talking about, but I feel it as like this is my shlichus, if you will. This is my kind of role with, I think, is what I see myself as like trying to do what the Rebbe wanted, is to reach Jews, is to try to find ways of saying like, I just want you to find a connection to who you are and your people, and not lose the sense of I'm doing this in the name of, right? L'shem, whatever it is, some kind of act of intentionality that's rooted in your Jewishness. That, I think, would be my way of trying to, that's my best answer to that, I think.
I think on that note of seeking connection and on looking for ways that we can be a part of multiple concentric circles of obligation, um, we've got to call it a conversation. Thank you, Paul, for coming to share your thinking with us today. You shared your mind, but you also opened your heart, and that is something that we are truly grateful for. We wish everyone a wonderful Freilich, an illuminated Hanukkah, and we will be back in January with our next Verbringen. Please join me in thanking the incomparable Paul Nahme.
Thank you all so very much.
Take good care,
Thanks
all.
for being here.
Thank you.